My name is Ankita Kulkarni. I'm a solutions architect at Wrangle.io. My topic for today is Accessibility 360, web to mobile. So let me start by asking y'all, how many of you have worked with accessibility in web apps? Raise your hand. Oh, that's quite a good number. What about mobile? How many of you have worked with accessibility in mobile apps? For example, in React Native. Okay, that's awesome. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw comparisons between web and mobile. So let's say if you are a React web developer, you can sort of see how accessibility is used in mobile apps, and vice versa. I work at a Toronto-based software consulting firm called Wrangle.io. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a solutions architect over there. And it's really fun working at Wrangle. And yeah, so I guess let's get started. So when it comes to accessibility, there are a lot more things to consider in terms of like different abilities. But in today's topic, I will only cover some of them just because of the time constraints, and there's a lot to cover in accessibility in general. So this is our agenda for today. The what? First, we'll go over how voiceover works, key accessibility properties, semantics. Then we will dive a little bit into dev by talking about the common components, design systems, few examples. And lastly, the takeaway, that is testing tools, lesson learned, and yeah, if you have any questions, come reach out to me after. So we need to make this world a better place for everyone. These days, everyone either has a computer or a mobile app, and it is very important to include everyone. The reality is that everyone has had some experience with disability, whether you are personally a person living with one or have a loved one living with one. So put your hand up if you ever had a broken arm or cut your finger, or let's say you had a blurry vision after you used eye drops. I mean, I did. We all did. And these are all forms of situations that we need to consider accessibility for. So accessibility could be permanent, temporary, situational, and so on. So this is a quote that I recently read, and this is some stats that I found online, and this literally blew my mind. From 2009 to 2014, mobile screen reader usage increased from 12% to 82% of people who use screen readers, a huge increase in 5 years. And hence, it is very, very important that we need to consider accessibility for mobile as well as web. But before I dive into a little bit of the code, let's take a look at how we can actually use or apply accessibility on the mobile. So let's see, how does voiceover work? But first, let me talk about what screen readers are. Screen readers are essentially computers. They work closely with computers' OS to provide information about icons, menus, dialogues. It helps users with visual impairments and reads the text out loud. Once you enable the voiceover, screen reader will start detecting elements on your screen. This is an example of a mobile app, and I'm going to start playing, and hopefully it will work. So as you can see, I'm in the settings screen itself, and
voiceover on.
Accessibility is okay. There's no audio.
Voiceover.
No audio.
Voiceover on.
Yep.
Settings. Accessibility. Portrait.
Okay.
Voiceover. Zoom. Magnifier. Display accommodate. Display speech. But
There you go. Okay, so let's start this over. So how does voiceover work? As you can see, I am going to go through different elements, and I'm going to turn on voiceover.
Voiceover on. Settings. Accessibility. Portrait. Voiceover. Zoom. Magnifier.
And as you can see over here in that voiceover demo itself, I'm going to click through different elements on the screen. A single tap is going to read out the element in the settings, whereas a double tap actually invokes that specific element itself. And this is in general how voiceover works. And it's very important that we all turn on voiceovers at some point and just to try out how accessibility in general works. So Instagram voiceover. So this is something that I started playing around with just to try out what are these different apps that actually are very popular, and I love using Instagram. How do they react when I actually turn on voiceover? So let's take a look at the demo over here.
Log out of Kulkarni Ankita. Alert. Log out of Kulkarni Ankita. Log out. Button. Button.
So, okay. Whoops.
Pop.
So as you can see over here, as the element is selected itself, I found that on Instagram when I tried to log out and I did turn on voiceover, the border, the black border that's highlighting the element itself, it's actually covering the button on top, and because of which I was unable to click on the element itself and I was unable to log in again. And this is like one small example on how someone who does have like voiceover turned on, how it would work. Now, as you can see over here, if let's say if I would like add padding and margin like below the border itself, then I'm able to click on all the elements on the UI. So just an example on like why accessibility is so important, and someone who does turn voiceover, how it's going to be very difficult for them to actually use Instagram and log back in. But again, there are some initiatives that all companies are taking just to add accessibility to mobile apps in general. So I'm going to take you on a journey on how I like to approach accessibility in projects. So here are some of the key considerations. So let's say, be it web or mobile, you're going to see that you're going to have some text on your screen, you're going to have different button states, you will have some sort of keyboard navigation, and also those specific apps they need to be compatible with all sort of screen sizes as well. So for example, text, we need to follow the semantics. Buttons has different states, and we take actions on them. And for keyboard navigation itself, on mobile, it's not that much of a change, but on web, for example, we need to have like tab index and being able to, let's say we cannot use mouse, then you need to be able to like use the keyboard and navigate all around. And every interactive element on the page needs to be accessible. So be it like web or mobile, it doesn't really matter because all these different elements are pretty common among each other. So let's take a look at the semantics. So on the left-hand side, this is like pure HTML and will be used in React apps. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's React Native, and this is how the sort of the one-to-one comparison works. It's kind of not one-to-one, but sort of to give you an idea on how the screen reader is going to interpret different elements and what actually is in web, how it gets converted to React Native, and what elements we use. So for example, over here, there's heading 1 on the left, and we're using paragraph. There's text elements that we would use on React Native. Similarly, a div would probably be a view. An input type text would probably be a text input, and a button on click would be like a button element component on React Native. We need to make sure that semantically, all these elements make sense. So don't use a div and add text to it. You can use a paragraph, because semantically that makes sense. And like make sure that when you're clicking or adding any functionality that involves clicks, use probably a button, because it's very important that we satisfy the requirements for accessibility. If you want to do some sort of fancy styling, add an icon, keep in mind how accessibility comes in play over here. And semantics are very important because half the job is going to get done just because screen reader is going to be able to detect all these different elements semantically. So make components accessible. So be it React or React Native, we are still following the fundamentals of components. What I like to do in projects is whenever I start a project or even when I join an existing project, being a consultant software developer, I'm making sure that I'm adding a wrapper around these components with the key accessibility properties to them. This will make the entire app accessible. I mean, not really, but it will start making the individual components accessible. So for example, if you're using a button, this is how the different states of the buttons would be. and I would add a button wrapper. So any developer on your team is going to utilize that button wrapper itself and start using accessibility right from the get-go. Start getting accessibility right from the get-go. This will really help onboard developers, and also, if there are any, you can also catch mistakes in your PRs and so on. So as you can see over here, there are different button states, an input text component, and so on. So these are the different states, and these are the sort of like the gist of it, that I would try creating buttons, input text component in my app and add a wrapper around them. And these are essentially the props of the button, right? So like there's an on press, but look at accessibility label, accessibility hint, and accessibility role. So these are the props that I would personally add to the button. There are probably other props as well, but I just wanted to get started as I'm starting the project so I can get a sense of how I can start adding accessibility slowly and steadily without taking probably a toll on my project work. And these are individual components, which are essentially native elements, but they end up forming a design system. So for example, these are just views, right? Like all these different elements are literally, the first one is a list, the second one is an alert box, and the third one is a loader. If I start making all these components and add wrappers around them and start adding accessibility properties to them, you can imagine that whenever I'm using an alert box anywhere in my app, it's going to prompt me that, hey, like accessibility label is a required prop, and you probably need to add it. And this ends up forming a design system. So every text component can take common properties. Every view wrapper can take accessibility props. And we can also start using a theme-based approach so that you can also think of like high contrast, color modes for different accessibility considerations. So this is an example of React Kit, and these are different components. A huge shout out to them just because they are literally striving for making their library accessible. And these are literally all their components. I mean, not all of them, but some of them. And if you can see, like there are a lot of common components over here, such as button, checkbox, dialog, and so on. So does this mean is my entire app accessible? Probably not. Just because even if I'm making all these individual components accessible, for example, a button, I need to still make sure how that button is going to interact with the form elements itself when I'm on the page. So that's why it's very important that we start seeing how they're going to work together. Because if you can imagine, individual components can be accessible, but try testing them out with different form elements itself and see if they are still accessible or not, and how you can improve it. What I did in my previous projects is I tried to work with the designers on my team just to get their opinion on like how I can make, what kind of labels I can add, how I can make these different components work together, and thus like it adds to like better collaboration. And I know all of you are thinking like, okay, now enough talk, show me some code. So let's get started with some code. So this is some example. On the left, I'm trying to draw comparisons between web and mobile. And this is some like pseudocode in terms of like how what's on the web and what's on the mobile itself. So for example, on the web, there is ARIA label, whereas on the mobile, there's accessibility label. So on the right-hand side, you will see that there's a phone, and there's a different text elements. So whenever I'm adding whenever I'm trying to use any sort of text element, these are the labels I would add. Next is accessibility states. Now, accessibility states tells a person either using voiceover on iOS or let's say talkback on Android, which is equivalent to voiceover. It will tell the state of the element that it's currently focusing on. The state can either be selected, disabled, or both. So in this case, on the right-hand side, you will see that these are the different list of checkbox elements. Even though there are the Game of Thrones characters listed over here, I haven't watched the final episode, so no spoilers, please. So if you can see, like on the web, you will see input type checkbox, which is semantically makes sense because it's a checkbox, right? Whereas on the right-hand side, I'm using something called Touchable, which is what I would need, which is what I would use on React Native. So I'm adding an accessibility label, and notice how I'm adding the accessibility states. If it's disabled, then I'm pushing the state to be disabled to the accessibility state, and I'm also adding the role button. On the left-hand side, I could also add an ARIA label for checkbox as well, just to make sure that whatever element is there, I can read it out. But notice how I'm using label underneath that. So that makes sense. I'm also using ARIA checked on the left-hand side as well, which is again state for the web. So if the button is invisible to the screen reader, it's going to probably ignore it. And that's why it's very important that with these different states, we'll notify the screen reader, hey, it's a checked button, hey, it's selected, it's not selected, and so on. A role and accessibility role. So for example, on the left-hand side, role is probably like one of the most important accessibility features. On the right-hand side, you will see that on the phone, I have a card element. It's pretty simple. It has an image, it has a couple of headers, and it has some text underneath that. Now, as you can see, on mobile, I'm adding accessibility role as image, role as header, and so on. Whereas on web, I'm adding role as image and role as header. And as you go through, as a screen reader is going through all these different elements, it's going to categorize and read out accordingly. Lastly, touchables. Again, we kind of touched touchables in a way, but on web, you will see that whenever you want a touchable that is something to be clickable, then you would use an ARIA label and an ARIA pressed equals false. Whereas on a mobile, you would actually use accessibility component type as button and a touchable without feedback because we don't necessarily want any feedback. And an accessibility label to the image itself. So this sort of gives you an idea that how accessibility can be applied in all these different cases. And these are all different elements, so you can imagine that if you start adding wrapper to all these different components itself, which I haven't done that here just to show you the real code itself, but it will really make our life easy as developers. And honestly, I saw a lot of improvements as we started adding all these different accessibility properties because you start having conversations with your team about what do you think that label should be, how do we make sure that we interact with this element, if there is enough padding or not, if there is enough margin or not, and so on. And what are the different roles as well. We also start taking a look at documentation together just to get more familiar with all these different accessibility docs. A lot of companies want to automate accessibility to hit their target audience. Now, automation is the best way because you can actually try to see how automation with accessibility is going to work in general. It really helps. I've used Detox in the past, which is a really good tool for that. But there are several other tools as well. Now, on web, acts as a browser extension for integrating accessibility into your existing testing environment. And there's Wave as well, which is sort of like an accessibility testing evaluation tool. On the right-hand side for mobile, there's Accessibility Inspector, which we will take a look in just a sec. And then there's VoiceOver, which we just enabled. There's Accessibility Scanner for Android, and we use TalkBack just like we use VoiceOver for iOS. So these are the different testing tools that we can use. So let's take a look at how it looks like. So this is essentially Accessibility Inspector on iOS on the right-hand side. What I really like about this is as you select an element while debugging or doing a development process, you can essentially see what the screen reader is going to interpret the specific element as. So you can suggest accessibility improvements without actually require any sort of like technical skills and whatnot. And you can also invoke an action, let's say if it's a button, right? Towards the bottom, it also shows us a tree in terms of how the different elements underneath are going to look like and what the specific node in that tree, where the specific node in that tree is. Whereas on the left-hand side, I got this specific image from a popular accessibility course. And as you can see, as I'm selecting the header element, it's showing me all the different props that the different ARIA label props that that specific element has. And this tree itself will really help you during the development process. As we were starting to work on stories, whenever we were working on any features on my team, we would sort of take a look at this tree together and also throw in a screenshot during the PR process that really helps, we inform the developers more about how the accessibility tree is going to look like and how the screen reader is going to evaluate. Accessibility linter. So these are a couple of tools, which are one for web and one for mobile. So shout out to both these tools just because it really helps it's like a plugin, ESLint plugin. So as you're developing and adding accessibility props to it, it will actually notify you that, hey, you are missing an ARIA label, or hey, you're missing an accessibility label, and so on. if you think that this specific tool doesn't cover all the different linters, different rules that you're looking for, then you can also add a custom rule, which really helps you. And we had this in one of the projects, and it really helped us just because, it's like, it's reminding me that, hey, like, you're missing this specific prop itself, even though the wrapper had a lot of this already. So we would add the additional props to the wrappers as well. But there's no substitute for real user feedback, right? So even though it's great, we are doing, as developers and designers, we're doing everything possible just to make sure that we're adding accessibility to all these different apps and all our features. But we want feedback, right? We want to give our apps to real users and ask them to try on how they are going to use it. Because there's no substitute for real user feedback, even though how much ever we try to automate it or however we think we might use the app. Again, something that I mentioned already about React, it gives you foundational building blocks that helps you build accessible web applications. It's a great tool because they actually follow all the different ARIA standards. And we saw an example already of the different components that are actually used. So when attributes cannot be automatically inferred, React will emit a warning and to basically remind you to pass them. So this is just one example of a button. And towards the bottom, like every component that they have a separate section on accessibility, which is great because it reminds me as a developer to go and read all these different properties as well and what exactly I should apply to my component. Animations. So be mindful of motion in general, just because animations are very powerful. We all love them. They're pretty fancy. But at the same time, they can actually cause dizziness, vertigo, or nausea. Just because if you think about accessibility, we need to make sure that we're using animations very carefully. So who likes Pokemon here? I mean, we all do, right? Well, on December 16, 1997, an episode of the Unstoppable Pokemon animated series was broadcasted in Japan. And literally, barely 30 minutes after, nearly 700 children were on their way to the hospital. And it's because of the animation effects that were used. So just an example that how we need to be really mindful on the animations that we use in our apps itself. Again, Incredibles 2 was another example of that, where I remember when I was walking into movie theaters, it would warn us literally that, hey, be careful because there's a flash effect on here, so if you have any problems, please don't watch this movie at all. And just because of that, it actually caused a lot of problems among individuals after they watched Incredibles 2. So what are some of the best practices of animations? Ensure animations don't flash too much. There's always provide a setting to disable animations. And also slow it down when reduced motion setting is activated in your phone. These are some of the lessons. Next, we'll go through some of the lessons that I learned when I was working with accessibility. As open source developers, we need to make sure that our libraries are as flexible as possible. Either add accessibility properties appropriately yourself, or allow the users to extend a fixed set of props. Recently, I was actually using an onboarding slider, and it actually had a fixed JSON that I could use in my app and try to just get the slider working. I tried to inject some accessibility props, but I was unable to, just because how opinionated the library was. I had to literally fork the repo just to add one line of accessibility prop to it. And this is an example that please make sure that as open source developers, just make sure that when you're adding accessibility properties, you are either making the library as flexible as possible or adding it yourself. And if you have already done that, you have done a good job, which is awesome. The reality is accessibility horribly breaks in Android than in iOS. So to get the apps working, just make sure that you actually get it working for Android first and then focus on iOS. And different is fine, different is great, but just something to be mindful of as well. Lastly, use Storybook for tracking accessibility components. Storybook is a developer environment for UI components. It allows you to browse a component library, view different states, and so on. This is one example of it. As we were adding all these different wrappers and all these different components of, and building a design system of our components, we were actually tracking our accessibility over there so that we know that which component is accessible and which is not. And here is a checklist that I really like, which really, literally reminds me as a developer and even as a designer on what are the different things I should be mindful of when I'm adding accessibility to my apps. So all these slides will be available online, so you can take a look at it after. And lastly, accessibility audit. Get an accessibility expert to perform the audit on your app as you build a few features. It's nothing like it. If we have actually recently performed an audit on one of the apps that we developed, and it was really valuable just to get a third-party review on it. Automate testing for accessibility as well. So automate all sorts of testing for accessibility because it really will help you speed up development process. And use Lighthouse for web, essentially. So Lighthouse is a tool that's very useful as you give it a URL, and it runs a series of audits against the page, and it generates the report on how well the page did. And this is really helpful. So just in general, accessibility should not be an afterthought, and this is something we should think of during the development process. And these are the things that I wanted to walk you through it so that these are some things that I did. And to be honest, just like how we built any other feature, we are adding accessibility to our apps. So don't be scared and try adding accessibility slowly and try having conversations with your team just to make it easy to talk to all developers and designers about it and create more awareness for it. So this is pretty much the end. If you have any questions, any comments, any feedback, please catch me after. I will be hanging out in the breaks around. And thank you so much.